Jacob Miller coughed, the metallic tang of blood coating his tongue as the world swam back into focus. Artillery fire ripped through the Virginia air, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. He blinked, trying to clear the haze. The ground beneath him vibrated with each earth-shattering blast. "Miller, get up, damn you!" Sergeant Calhoun's voice, raspy and urgent, cut through the din. He saw the man looming over him, face grimed with soot and worry etched into the lines around his eyes. Jacob pushed himself to his elbows, a searing pain lancing through his head. He reached up, fingers brushing against something hard and unyielding just above his brow. "What in tarnation?" he muttered, pulling his hand away. It came back smeared with blood. Calhoun grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet. "No time for that, son. We're falling back. They've broken through the line." He stumbled, his legs shaky beneath him. The screams of the wounded and dying filled his ears, a symphony of agony that mingled with the thunder of cannons. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the shock. "But the line—" Jacob managed, his voice a mere croak. "Doesn't matter now. It's every man for himself. Head for the woods, Miller. Head for the woods." Calhoun shoved him forward, then turned back towards the chaos, his rifle raised. He didn't see Calhoun again. Jacob stumbled, his legs heavy and unresponsive, towards the tree line. The woods offered a promise of concealment, a respite from the carnage, but his head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. He touched his forehead gingerly. It felt wet. He pulled his hand back, his fingers slick with blood. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He pressed onward, ignoring the stinging in his lungs and the leaden weight of his fear. Reaching the edge of the woods, he plunged into the undergrowth, clawing his way through thorny bushes and tangled vines. The sounds of battle faded slightly, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the frantic chirping of birds disturbed by the fighting. He needed to stop, to catch his breath, to figure out what to do. He collapsed against the thick trunk of an oak, his body shaking uncontrollably. The bleeding hadn't stopped. He fumbled in his pack for a rag, anything to staunch the flow. His fingers brushed against a crumpled letter from his mother, its ink blurred with tears, his and hers. He pushed it aside, finding a relatively clean piece of cloth. Pressing it against his forehead, he closed his eyes, willing himself to calm down. He couldn't think straight. He was alone, wounded, and surrounded by enemies, or at least he assumed he was surrounded. He hadn't seen any Confederates in the woods, but that didn't mean they weren't there, damn it, he muttered, the word escaping in a shaky breath. He had to move. He couldn't stay here, a sitting duck. He forced himself to stand, his head spinning. He needed to find other Union soldiers to rejoin his unit. But where were they? Which way was north? He hadn't paid attention during the retreat. His only thought had been to escape the slaughter. He chose a direction at random, deeper into the woods, hoping to find a road or a stream, anything that could guide him. The trees grew thicker, the shadows deeper. The air grew colder, a damp chill that seeped into his bones. The bleeding from his head had slowed, but the throbbing was intensifying, a relentless hammer against his skull. He walked for what felt like hours, his progress slow and arduous. He stumbled over roots, tripped on unseen obstacles, each fall sending a jolt of pain through his head. He was weak, hungry, and thirsty. He hadn't eaten since the morning, and his canteen was empty. Suddenly he heard a sound, a twig snapping. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it an animal or something else? He strained his ears, listening intently. Then he heard it again, closer this time. A footstep. He quickly ducked behind a thick bush, peering through the leaves. A man emerged from the trees, clad in grey, a Confederate soldier. He was young, barely older than Jacob himself, his face gaunt and weary. He carried a rifle, but it was slung over his shoulder, his posture suggesting fatigue rather than aggression. The soldier stopped, leaning against a tree, his shoulders slumping. He looked utterly defeated. Jacob held his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol tucked into his belt. He could kill him. End it quickly, but something stayed his hand. The soldier looked so lost, so much like he felt. He watched the soldier for a long moment, his mind racing. He could try to sneak past him, avoid a confrontation altogether. But the woods were thick, and the soldier was alert, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. "Hello?" The soldier called out, his voice surprisingly soft. "Is anyone there?" Jacob remained hidden, his heart pounding in his ears. "I ain't gonna hurt you," the soldier continued. "I'm just tired and lost." Jacob hesitated. He didn't trust him. He couldn't trust him. But the soldier's voice, it sounded so genuine, so desperate. He slowly stood up, his pistol still in his hand but lowered to his side. The soldier startled, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But he quickly stopped, his eyes widening in surprise. You're a Yankee," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob nodded slowly. "And you're a Reb." The soldier stared at him, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. What are you doing here?" "Trying to survive," Jacob replied, his voice hoarse. "Just like you, I reckon." The two young men stood facing each other, their rifles hanging uselessly at their sides. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and the weight of the war that had brought them to this desolate place. Jacob could feel the blood now crusting on his forehead. He wondered if the soldier could see it. He wondered if he cared. I ain't fired my rifle all day," the soldier said, breaking the silence. Just been walking." Jacob didn't reply. He just kept staring at the soldier, trying to gauge his intentions. "My name's Thomas," the soldier said, extending his hand. "Thomas Abernathy." Jacob hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out and shook his hand. Jacob Miller. Their hands met, a brief and awkward connection in the midst of a brutal and senseless war. Jacob felt the calluses on Thomas's palm, the grip surprisingly firm. "You're hurt," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on Jacob's forehead. Jacob touched the wound again, wincing. "Yeah, I reckon I am." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Come on," he said. "I know a place. It's not much, but it's shelter. And I got some water." Jacob eyed him warily. "Why would you help me?" Thomas shrugged. "Like you said, we're both just trying to survive." He paused, then added almost to himself, "Besides, I'm tired of fighting. Why would you help me?" Jacob asked, suspicion etching lines around his tired eyes. Thomas shrugged, the movement stiff, betraying his own fatigue. "Like you said, we're both just trying to survive." He paused, then added almost to himself, "Besides, I'm tired of fighting." Jacob scrutinized him, the silence stretching taut. He saw no deceit, only a weariness that mirrored his own. His head throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharper pain in his forehead. He was in no position to argue. "All right," Jacob conceded, his voice raspy. "Lead the way." Thomas nodded, turning and heading towards the dense tree line bordering the ravaged field. Jacob followed, each step a protest from his aching muscles. The air grew cooler beneath the canopy, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sound their boots crunching on fallen branches. Finally, Thomas stopped before a shallow cave, barely more than an overhang in a rocky outcrop. "It ain't the Ritz," Thomas said, gesturing towards the opening. "But it's dry." Jacob peered inside. The cave was small and cramped, but it offered protection from the elements. He ducked inside, relief washing over him as he sat down on the dirt floor, leaning against the cool stone. Thomas followed, pulling a small canteen from his pack. He offered it to Jacob. "Water," he said simply. Jacob took it gratefully, tilting his head back and letting the cool liquid trickle down his parched throat. It was the best thing he'd tasted in days. He handed the canteen back. "Thanks," Jacob said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. Thomas took a swig, then capped the canteen. He sat down opposite Jacob, a small fire already crackling merrily between them. "So," he said, looking at Jacob's forehead again, "what happened there?" Jacob instinctively touched the wound. "Gettysburg," he said, his voice flat. "Third day." "Ball. Doc said it wasn't safe to dig it out." Thomas whistled softly. 60 years. You've been carrying that thing around for 60 years? Jacob nodded. More or less. Caused me a few headaches over the years. He offered a wry smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing into the darkness. The silence returned, heavier this time, laden with unspoken questions and shared experiences. Jacob found himself studying Thomas, trying to decipher the man's motives. He seemed genuinely weary, but Jacob had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. "What about you?" Jacob asked finally. "Why are you out here?" Thomas stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Lost my farm," he said quietly. "Bank took it. Said I couldn't pay the mortgage. Hard times, Jacob murmured, understanding dawning. The war had ended, but its consequences lingered, a bitter aftertaste in the mouths of many. Hard times indeed, Thomas echoed. He looked up at Jacob, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. They said I was a burden. An old soldier who'd outlived his usefulness. Jacob felt a pang of sympathy. He knew that feeling all too well. He had been dismissed as an old man, a relic of a bygone era. So what are you going to do? Jacob asked. Thomas shrugged again. Don't know, he admitted. Just trying to survive, like you said. He reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of hardtack. He broke it in half and offered one piece to Jacob. Jacob accepted it, gnawing on the dry biscuit. It was meager fare, but it was better than nothing. As they ate in silence, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he and Thomas were bound together by something more than just shared misfortune. They were both survivors, haunted by the past, struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The bullet in his forehead, a constant reminder of the war, throbbed in time with the beat of his heart. He wondered if he'd ever truly be free of it. Jacob accepted it, gnawing on the dry biscuit. It was meager fare, but it was better than nothing. As they ate in silence, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he and Thomas were bound together by something more than just shared misfortune. They were both survivors, haunted by the past, struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The bullet in his forehead, a constant reminder of the war, throbbed in time with the beat of his heart. He wondered if he'd ever truly be free of it. Heard tell of work further west, Thomas finally said, breaking the silence. Railroad expanding. Rough work, but pays in coin, Jacob grunted. Railroad work. Back-breaking labor under a blistering sun. He was an old man, after all. The thought of it made his joints ache. Coin's worth little if you ain't got the strength to spend it, he replied. Thomas looked at him, a flicker of something akin to challenge in his eyes. And what strength do you have left, old-timer? Besides the strength to complain? Jacob bristled. Enough to bury you where you stand if I took a mind to. The words came out harsher than he intended. The constant pain, the dismissive looks, the feeling of being useless, it all coalesced into a raw, simmering anger. Thomas didn't flinch. Maybe so, he said, his voice low, but burying's a young man's game. Takes a strong back to dig a grave. He paused, then added, Besides, I ain't looking for a fight, just trying to survive. The air hung heavy between them. Jacob knew Thomas was right. He was too old for fighting, too tired for pointless squabbles. But the resentment, the bitterness, it was hard to let go. West, you say? He asked, his voice softening. West, Thomas confirmed. Heard they're hiring anyone with 2 arms and a pulse. Don't much care about age, long as you can swing a hammer. Jacob considered it. He hadn't swung a hammer in years. His hands, gnarled and scarred, were more accustomed to the feel of a rifle. But the rifle was gone and the war was over. Maybe it was time to try something new, even if it meant breaking his back in the process. And what makes you think I'd want to go with you? Jacob asked, testing the waters. Seems to me you'd be better off on your own. Thomas shrugged. Maybe, but misery loves company. And you look about as miserable as I feel. He grinned, a flash of genuine humor in his eyes. Jacob couldn't help but crack a smile in return. He hadn't smiled in what felt like an eternity. All right, he said. West it is. But I'm warning you I ain't carrying you if you fall behind. Wouldn't dream of it, Thomas replied. Now let's get moving. The sun's going down and I'd rather not sleep out here with the wolves. They packed their meager belongings and set off, walking side by side along the dusty road. The setting sun cast long shadows, stretching out before them like specters of the past. Jacob could feel the bullet throbbing in his forehead, a constant reminder of the battles he had fought, the lives he had taken. He wondered if he could ever truly escape the war, or if it would forever be a part of him, etched into his very being like the lead lodged in his skull. As they walked, Jacob noticed a group of men approaching from the opposite direction. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in ragged clothes and carrying rifles. They eyed Jacob and Thomas with suspicion as they drew closer. Hold up there, old-timers, one of the men said, his voice gruff. Where do you think you're going? Jacob stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for the place where his pistol used to be. He hadn't carried a weapon since the war ended, but the habit was ingrained deep within him. Just passing through, he said, his voice steady. Headed west, the man sneered. West, eh? And what do you plan on doing out there? Too old to work, ain't you? We'll find something, Thomas said, stepping forward. It's none of your concern. The man's eyes narrowed. Maybe it is. We're looking for a few strong backs to help us with a little project. You two look like you could be useful. Jacob didn't like the way this was going. He could sense the danger in the air, the unspoken threat hanging over them. We're not interested, he said firmly. We have our own plans. The man chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. You don't seem to understand. You don't have a choice. He gestured to his companions, who fanned out around Jacob and Thomas, effectively cutting off their escape. Now, are you going to come with us willingly, or are we going to have to make you? Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline. He was old and he was tired, but he wasn't about to be bullied by these thugs. He glanced at Thomas, who was standing beside him, his face grim. They were outnumbered and they were outgunned, but they weren't beaten yet. The bullet in his head seemed to pulse with a renewed intensity, a burning reminder of his will to survive. He tightened his fists, preparing for a fight. The war may have been over, but the battle for his life was just beginning. We're old men, Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. What use could we possibly be to you? The leader smirked, a flash of yellowed teeth. Don't underestimate yourselves. We need men who know how to work, men who aren't afraid of a little discomfort. He took a step closer to Jacob, his eyes fixed on the faint scar on his forehead. And you, old-timer. You look like you've seen your share of trouble. Jacob stood his ground. He knew that showing fear would only embolden them. Trouble finds everyone eventually, he replied, his voice low and gravelly. Maybe so, the man said, reaching out a hand towards Jacob's shoulder. But some men are better at handling it than others. Jacob instinctively flinched away from the touch, his hand clenching into a fist. The movement was subtle, but the leader noticed it. His smirk widened. See, there's fight in you yet. He dropped his hand. Come on now. Let's not make this difficult. We have a long way to go. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Jacob and the leader. We're not going anywhere with you. The leader sighed, a theatrical gesture of exasperation. All right, old man. You asked for it. He nodded to his companions. Take them. The two men flanking Jacob and Thomas moved in quickly. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he braced himself for the attack. He might be old, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He feinted left, then swung a right hook at the man closest to him. The blow connected with a satisfying thud, sending the man stumbling back. Thomas, meanwhile, was grappling with the other assailant. He was surprisingly strong for his age, but the younger man had the advantage in reach and agility. Jacob saw Thomas take a blow to the face and stagger. "Thomas!" Jacob shouted, his concern momentarily distracting him. The leader seized the opportunity. He lunged forward and slammed his fist into Jacob's stomach. The air rushed out of Jacob's lungs and he doubled over in pain. He felt a sharp, throbbing pain in his head, as if the bullet lodged there had suddenly shifted. He gasped for breath, trying to regain his composure. He knew he couldn't afford to lose. He had to protect Thomas. He straightened up, ignoring the pain, and faced his attacker. He saw a glint of steel in the man's hand. A knife. The leader lunged again, the knife flashing in the sunlight. Jacob dodged, narrowly avoiding the blade. He grabbed the man's wrist, trying to disarm him. They struggled, locked in a desperate embrace. Jacob could feel the man's strength, the desperation in his movements. He knew he couldn't hold on for long. The bullet in his head throbbed relentlessly, clouding his vision. He could feel his strength waning. Suddenly he felt a sharp pain in his side. He looked down and saw the knife buried deep in his flesh. He gasped, a strangled sound escaping his lips. The leader wrenched the knife free and stepped back, a look of triumph on his face. Jacob stumbled, clutching his side. He felt a warm, sticky liquid spreading through his fingers. He looked at Thomas, who was still struggling with the other man. He knew he had to do something, anything, to help him. He couldn't let Thomas be taken. He focused all his remaining strength, ignoring the pain, and charged at the leader. He tackled him to the ground, knocking the knife from his hand. They wrestled on the dusty road, each fighting for their life. Jacob was losing. He could feel his strength ebbing away, the darkness closing in. He knew he was going to die, but he wasn't going to die without a fight. He wasn't going to let these men win. He reached out, his fingers closing around a small, smooth stone on the ground. He gripped it tightly, feeling the rough texture against his skin. With a final surge of adrenaline, he slammed the stone into the leader's temple. The man went limp, his body collapsing beneath Jacob's weight. Jacob lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body racked with pain. He could feel the blood seeping from his wound, the life draining out of him. He looked over at Thomas, who had finally managed to subdue his attacker. Thomas rushed over to Jacob, his face etched with concern. "Jacob!" he cried, kneeling beside him. "Are you all right?" Jacob managed a weak smile. "I'll be all right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a scratch." He knew he was lying. He knew he was dying. But he didn't want Thomas to worry. "We need to get you to a doctor," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "No," Jacob said, shaking his head weakly. "It's too late." He closed his eyes, feeling the darkness closing in. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and the life they had built together. He thought of the war, the friends he had lost, the horrors he had witnessed. He had survived so much. He had lived a long and full life. He had no regrets. He took a final breath, a ragged, shallow gasp, and then he was gone. The bullet in his head, silent for so long, finally rested. He closed his eyes, feeling the darkness closing in. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and the life they had built together. He thought of the war, the friends he had lost, the horrors he had witnessed. He had survived so much. He had lived a long and full life. He had no regrets. He took a final breath, a ragged, shallow gasp, and then he was gone. The bullet in his head, silent for so long, finally rested. Thomas slumped back, the chair creaking in protest. The telegram lay forgotten on the floor, its message now tragically irrelevant. He stared at Jacob's still form, the flickering gaslight casting long shadows across the room. 60 years! 60 years with a piece of lead lodged inches from his brain. It was a miracle, a testament to the man's stubborn will. 60 years, Thomas whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He reached out, his hand hovering over Jacob's forehead. He couldn't bring himself to touch it. The thought of the bullet, the thing that had brought so much pain and yet allowed him to live so long, was too much. A soft knock echoed from the hallway. It was Mrs. Abernathy, their landlady, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Miller all right, Mr. Davies? I heard a commotion." Thomas rose, his shoulders heavy. "He's gone, Mrs. Abernathy," he passed peacefully. He stepped aside, allowing her a glimpse into the room. She gasped, clutching her chest. "Oh dear, the poor man. 60 years, you say? A long life, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "The war. It takes so much from us, even decades later." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for Jacob, but for an era, a generation scarred by violence and yet forged in resilience. He knew he had to send word to Jacob's daughter, Martha, who lived up north. A wave of exhaustion washed over him. He suddenly felt every one of his own years. I'll handle things, Mrs. Abernathy. Thank you for your concern." She squeezed his arm gently. "Anything I can do, you just let me know, Mr. Davies. Anything at all." As she retreated, Thomas returned to Jacob's side. He knelt, his gaze fixed on the old man's face. He noticed for the first time a faint, almost imperceptible swelling just above Jacob's right eyebrow. It was barely noticeable, but in the stark light it was there. The bullet, an idea almost absurd, began to form in his mind. An idea that was both morbid and strangely compelling. He remembered the doctor's words, the doctor who had dismissed Jacob's complaints as the ramblings of an old man. He remembered the X-ray, the image of the Minier ball, so clear and undeniable. He had to know. He had to see it for himself. He had to understand how Jacob had lived, how he had endured with that piece of metal lodged in his skull. It was a scientific curiosity, yes, but it was also something more. It was a testament to the human body, to the human spirit. Thomas stood, his decision made. He knew it was disrespectful, perhaps even sacrilegious, but he couldn't help himself. He needed to see the bullet. He needed to understand. Jacob didn't die. Thomas's trembling hands fumbled, finding a faint pulse in Jacob's thin wrist. "He's alive!" "Just barely." He yelled for Martha, Jacob's daughter, who rushed in, her face a mask of terror. They labored together, Martha applying cool cloths to Jacob's forehead, Thomas whispering encouragements. Hours bled into the night. The only sound was the crackling fire and their ragged breathing. When the first rays of dawn touched the room, Jacob coughed. His eyes fluttered open. "Pa?" Martha whispered, relief flooding her face. Jacob looked at her, confusion clouding his gaze. "Martha, what happened?" "You collapsed, Pa. Thomas found you." He tried to sit up, wincing. A sharp pain lanced through his head, sharper than anything he'd felt in years. He instinctively reached for his forehead, feeling the familiar indentation beneath his skin. "The bullet," he rasped. "It's moving." Fear tightened Martha's grip on his hand. Thomas, ever practical, spoke. "We still need a doctor, Jacob. This changes things." This time Jacob didn't resist. He was too weak, too disoriented. The pain was too intense. The year was 1913. Medicine had advanced. The local doctor, a young man named Davies, fresh out of medical school, examined Jacob. He was skeptical. But the lump on Jacob's forehead, the old scar tissue, and the man's rambling stories of Vicksburg and Shiloh convinced him to investigate. An X-ray machine, a marvel of modern science, confirmed the impossible. Lodged in Jacob's frontal lobe, a mini ball, pristine and deadly. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Davies said, his voice hushed with awe. "It's a miracle you're alive." The surgery was risky, Dr. Davies warned them. Jacob could die on the table. He could suffer brain damage, but leaving the bullet was a guaranteed death sentence. Jacob looked at Martha, her face etched with worry. He looked at Thomas, his loyal friend. He thought of Sarah, his beloved wife, buried these last 20 years. What was there to lose? "Do it," he said, his voice firm. The surgery lasted hours. Martha and Thomas waited, their nerves stretched thin. Finally, Dr. Davies emerged, his face pale but triumphant. "We got it," he announced. He held out his hand, revealing a lead bullet, tarnished with age. Jacob recovered slowly. The pain was excruciating, but he was alive, and something had shifted within him. The bullet, a constant reminder of war and death, was gone. He felt lighter. He started talking, not the disjointed ramblings of a dying man, but stories. Vivid, heartbreaking, and sometimes humorous tales of the war. He told Martha about the camaraderie, the fear, the senseless waste. He told her about Sarah, about their dreams for a future he almost didn't live to see. He told his story to Dr. Davies, who, fascinated, wrote it all down. Jacob Miller, the man who survived the Civil War with a bullet in his head for 50 years, became a local legend. Newspapers picked up the story. People came from miles around to see him, to hear him speak. He became a symbol of resilience, of the enduring power of the human spirit. One crisp autumn afternoon, sitting on his porch, watching the leaves turn crimson and gold, Jacob turned to Martha. "You know," he said, his voice raspy but strong, "for all those years, that bullet was like a stone in my heart, weighing me down, making it hard to breathe." He paused, looking out at the horizon. "Now that it's gone, I feel like I can finally see clearly. Like I can finally... Life?" He closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. He saw Sarah's face, young and radiant. He heard the laughter of children he never had. He felt the warmth of the sun on his skin. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs. When Martha checked on him later, she found him still sitting on the porch, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful. In his lap he held the Minier ball, a silent testament to a war long past. The bullet, finally dislodged, had carried with it the